Great. So these are the other two that I think you'll be finding yourself using the most, and they kind of provide more of kind of a spatial atmosphere rather than directly affecting the sound that's happening in the track. They kind of add to it. The first one is going to be reverb. So let's just disable the compressors and everything that we have and focus on the synth. I'm going to add directly on the audio effects and not on a send. I'll do the sends later. That's kind of a part of a different section of signal routing that we'll get into. I'm going to put reverb directly on the track. So reverb. Let's just do chromoverb because it's the easiest to visualize. If you have the most updated logic, this should be an option for you as well. So chromoverb, you're putting this instrument or this sample or whatever you have in that track active into a space, and then you get to design. Another option actually here is the space designer, which is a means of doing the same thing is you're putting the instrument in a space and then modifying how that space interacts with the sounds that it's making. So reverb is a product of putting something into a space and then just see what it sounds like and you'll know. So again, the dry and the wet here, dry being the signal that's coming in and wet being the signal after it's modified. If I were to change this to a 0% dry and 100% wet, it's the same thing as going into the compressor here and going from input all the way to output. It's the same ratio basically. Don't let the word ratio confuse you because you also have this ratio up here for the compressor. The ratio being how much dry versus wet signal you have is what I'm referring to. So this is what 100% wet sounds like. It's merely a product of the reverb happening on the track, and this is what 100% dry sounds like. It's just the signal coming in with nothing being modified. So you want to have a balance between these two of how much signal is coming in and how much change you're actually making. So that's the input and output, dry and wet ratio. This is the distance. So the distance is basically your location, your position in the room in relationship to where the instrument is being affected. So if I'm standing right next to the piano when someone's playing, I'm not going to hear a ton of the reverb. I may hear it as a product of the room, maybe when it bounces off the back wall and comes back. But if I'm standing in the back of the room, I'm going to hear more of the reverb than I am the piano or whatever. So going back to this bass example, I'll just change the distance. You're hearing it kind of interact with the space more if you up the distance. The decay is basically how long the tail is of the reverb. You can map that to your project tempo if you want, but I'll just keep it on milliseconds and stuff because it's easier to visualize that way. So as I shorten the decay, it's going to basically taper off the end of the reverb faster, and it's not going to linger as much. But if I up the decay to like 6 or 7 seconds, you'll hear it actually progress through the space a lot slower. So it's kind of cascading and building off of itself. And if I freeze it, I'll freeze it at 1 second or so. Do you hear that kind of like static wind noise in the background? It's because it's like sampling the reverb that's coming out of it and like keeping it as a drone as constant in the background. So look, the particles are still moving. That could be a very cool effect for you to kind of design soundscapes and ambient noise and whatnot. Noise wall. Yeah. And then the attack, the size, and the density are kind of the other 3 parameters to adjust for the envelope of the reverb when it comes out. Then pre-delay is how long it takes for the reverb signal to generate after the original signal was played. So if this is short, it's going to happen right after. And if it's long, it's going to wait for the reverb to take effect after 100 milliseconds of when it gets the signal. And then this main window where you're seeing all these kind of particles generate is actually the same as the EQ window. It's a frequency manager and analyzer. So if you want to see what frequency the reverb is actually occupying, let's go to 100% wet for a second, and I'll start playing around with this and you'll see what changes it makes. you're basically designing which frequency range the reverb occupies. So frequency, ratio, and Q factor again down here. Ratio is basically the gain, up or down. And then if I wanted to change the space, you can go up here to room, you change it to a chamber, change it to a hall, you can change it to a reflective hall, a little bloomy verb, a little airy little guy. There's a bunch of options here. It's a cool kind of space designer tool that it gives you. Also, the space designer tool that it gives you is a means of doing the same thing. There's a bunch of presets in here, length, size, dry and wet ratio are all the same, pre-delay is the same. This one you can actually reverse. So if you get the timing right with this one, and that's kind of a product of adjusting the size. So the size here, I'm trying to point to things with my hands, but you can't see my hands. But the size is like how many milliseconds it tapers off. So if you have a short size with a reverse reverb, it's kind of gonna repeat more often. And this is what it sounds like. I'll lower the size and I'll give you just the wet. So it's taking a very short envelope of the signal feeding through the reverb, reversing it, and then playing it back for you. So you can kind of hear the transients with a shorter size. But if I up the size, you're not going to hear the transients. It's just going to be a bunch of bleeding noise. And if you ask me, it's a really cool effect. So use reverb creatively, experiment, and get crazy. So length and size, I guess, are both kind of parameters that you could choose to taper off your sound. And then there's a crossover, which is basically how much the lows of the reverb are feeding into stereo, how much the whole signal is feeding into stereo. So if I want the crossover point at 500, 600 hertz, means everything below 600 hertz as a product of the reverb is going to sum to mono, and then everything above that is going to spread out to stereo. And that's pretty important because you usually want your low end in mono. It's a means of kind of keeping all of your phase aligned, because low frequencies are much more likely to either phase cancel or phase align than high frequencies. So if you use the crossover to kind of tame that lower end, it'll keep all of your stuff in phase, which is pretty important. And we'll go over phase, I think, when we go over signal routing and stuff, or maybe microphones. We'll get into it at some point. A couple other things you can do in here. The filter envelope is basically tapering. You could see it actually affecting the size and everything of the sample. But you could just take like the beginning of the sample and then like fold it in or like fade it into the thing. Let's put this in normal terms, not backwards. So you could see the shape actually adjusting when we adjust these curves. If I wanted like a higher attack and a shorter decay, you could do that here, all in the filter envelope. So, and then again, you have an output EQ. So if I want to tame the low end or whatever of my reverb. It's kind of a grumbly low end there on that reverb, so you have that option. Cool. Let's get into delay. All right, let me delete the reverb here. I'm going to add a delay directly onto the channel strip here, and you find those under delay. There's a delay designer, there's an echo, there's a stereo delay, and there's a tape delay. And I'm skipping sample delay for now because that's more of an imaging tool, and we'll get into that when we go over that. But delay designer being the most straightforward, I'll open that. This kind of looks like an older plugin, but there's a lot of cool features here. I would mainly just scroll through the presets to start because they do kind of a lot of work on the back end that you don't have to worry about. So let's go to simple, 1/8 inch alternating pan. You'll see this window puts one delay every 1/8 note based on the tempo of your project. And now it'll basically trigger a delay, which is a short sample of the signal it's getting into the delay chain. And here's what it sounds like. So when I pause, you can hear the delay kind of being sampled as it goes. The most important parameters here, one is the note that it's actually sampling on, which is how often it triggers. The second is the dry and wet mix, which you get in every plugin, how much dry signal and how much wet is coming through. And then the third being feedback. So feedback is how many iterations it'll trigger by the time it tapers out. So the lower the feedback, the lower the amount of triggers, and the higher the feedback, the more the triggers last. That kind of feedback onto itself. So just don't go above unity here. Don't go above 100%, because then the feedback will be feeding off of itself, and it's a great way to blur your speakers or mute your, deafen yourself and stuff like that. So this plugin is confusing. There's also a resonance adjuster for each sample. There's a transposer for each sample. So if I want the third one to go down 7 semitones and the fourth one to go up 5, let's see what that sounds like real quick. You could kind of hear it at the end, pitch up and down. There's also a pan, so you could have these pan left and right between the ears. That's what they're doing, is alternating. And then there's a level, which is how loud it is for each sample. We're going to close this because that's kind of one of the more confusing ones. We're going to open Echo next. Echo is a much simpler version of this. It's basically the note, the feedback, and the dry and wet, which are the 3 parameters that I told you are most important. Then the color is basically whether it goes up in frequency or down in frequency. And it's like kind of a low pass or a high pass. So you get the gist. And then the sample delay, the stereo delay and the tape delay are 2 of the same plugins. Stereo is just a stereo version of the tape delay. Tape delay is again a very similar thing as the delay designer. It just samples one piece of your signal, what's called a tape, I guess, in this circumstance, and then feeds that into the delay. And then a stereo delay, it gives you a left and a right channel for you to mess around with. So again, you have the feedback here per channel. You can link them together if you want. This is the output mix for both, and now this is the output mix for just one. And then this has a high and a cut, high cut and low cut EQ. This has a note, eighth dotted, quarter note. You can have them change, which frequency each side is occupying. If you want to up the frequency or up the feedback on one and lower the frequency on the other, you could do that. You could change the phase. You could swap the phase on either of these channels. This is a customized routing that I made, but they also have presets here too, and here. So anyways, this is what this sounds like. My feedbacks are pretty low right now, so is my output mix, so you may not have heard the last kind of cadence to that. Let me just adjust these. Now listen for the delay. It's stereo. Loads of fun. Anyways, what I'm doing currently is routing these directly on the instruments as a plugin in the channel strip, which is not something I'd recommend doing. I'd usually use kind of your auxiliary effects on auxiliary channels. Channel EQ and compression, usually you want to keep those directly on the channel strip because you want it to address 100% of the sound going through it. But these kind of peripheral effects I would put on a bus. And we will get into signal flow in the next section. So I will kind of explain what all this kind of different signal routing actually achieves.